Hello, everyone. We're going to give things one more minute just to let people trickle in. My name is Neria. I am the Executive Director of the Jimmy Pratt Foundation. Thank you so much for coming on this beautiful, beautiful day. So let's give people another couple minutes and we will get started soon. Just so you know, if anyone's having trouble connecting, I am acting as tech support for this whole session. So if you're having trouble hearing anything, just like shoot me a quick message. You just have to pop to the chat feature. Go to all panel. Well, you can just go all panelists and attendees, or you can directly message me, either or, and I will try to help you out. So I just got a question about whether all the attendees are muted. You are muted because this is the webinar function, so do not worry. So let's take it away. So my name is Neria. As I said, I'm the Executive Director of the Jimmy Pratt Foundation, and I'm your tech nerd for today, which is too bad for you because I'll figure things out. I'm not much of a tech nerd, but I'm good at Zoom, so that's enough. Just to start out, I am actually going to steal a little thing I saw in a Food First webinar, which is I would love for everyone to introduce themselves in the chat. If you can, tell me who you are, who you're coming with, like if you're with an organization, and tell me your favorite berry recipe. The last one I was on, we did our favorite vegetable, but I think it's more berry season. We're at the end of berry season, so tell me your favorite berry recipe. Mine is partridge berry pie. So anyways, just before we get started, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the Jimmy Pratt Foundation. We're a private family foundation based in St. John's and founded in 2008. Our mission is to identify and promote things that help children be resilient. So when they're facing adverse circumstances, what are those things that make kids thrive despite those circumstances? And those tends to be the kind of things that help everybody. So for us, like what that's meant during COVID-19 is really investing in food security and work, and that's what brings us to this conversation, because that's a really foundational aspect of children's thriving, is having access to nutritious, healthy food. So that's what brings us here today. But other areas where we work are early childhood education, and we advocate for quality, accessible, and affordable early childhood education. That includes kindergarten, that includes preschool, childcare options. We're about all that stuff. So if any of those things are things that you're also interested in, you know who to talk to. My emails are always open about anything about that. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Sarah Crocker, our facilitator today, who's going to introduce our wonderful, wonderful panelists.
Thanks, Neria, for that introduction. I'm really excited to bring together a bit of a conversation about food banks and food insecurity. We're focusing a bit on St. John's because my area of interest over the next year is doing a food assessment of St. John's. This is through a project we're working on with the city and multiple other funders to deepen our understanding of the food system. But we can't talk about St. John's without connecting that to bigger issues across the province. And Food First NL is a provincial nonprofit. Our mission is to ensure access to adequate, healthy food that is healthy and culturally appropriate. It really gets to the heart of things that we need to be able to afford food that keeps us well. We need to be able to access it easily. And it's really coming down to a commitment to engage people in a collaborative way and build a diverse network so we can address the complex issues of food insecurity in our communities. So today we're joined by Leah White, who's with Second Harvest, kind of new to our St. John's scene, which will tell you a bit more about that. We've got Debbie Wiseman, community advocate, probably seen her in the media as part of Sharing the Harvest NL. We're also joined by Neria and Katie from the Jimmy Pratt Foundation. I've been working closely with Katie based on the experiences of running the community food helpline. And as well, we also have Nancy Mercer, who will be able to chime in with our, as well, a bit of a community perspective of food bank users. And unfortunately, Sarah Keene from the Salvation Army wasn't able to join us today, but I'm hoping she might be able to pop in a bit later to provide a bit of a food bank operator perspective and some of the unique things they're working on with the new Chess Penny Center for Hope. So thank you everyone for joining. From the title of our presentation, Never Enough. So with so many fantastic people working to address food insecurity in our communities, we sort of realized that the role of food banks keeps expanding, number of visits keeps going up, and what can we do about that? What are some ways we can overcome some stigma of accessing food banks, and how can we better coordinate with the limited resources, volunteers, and finances that community organizations have? So introducing some terms here, food insecurity really gets to our ability to afford food. This is measured nationally through a survey called the Canadian Community Health Survey. And the most recent survey information that we have is from 2017-2018 years. And that's analyzed by a group at the University of Toronto called Proof. And they take all this information and break it down, and the numbers show that our province, Newfoundland and Labrador, has a rate of 14.7% of people experience some form of food insecurity. This could be marginal food insecurity, where there's a lot of worry about food, trying to make it stretch, to moderate to severe food insecurity, where going days without eating, skipping meals. Thinking about nationally, Newfoundland has changed its status over the years, being more or less, and it's very sensitive to our economics, our different kinds of policy. And so where we are, the most recent, before COVID-19, before Snowmageddon, is the second highest rate across all Canadian provinces. And for the city of St. John's, it's even more acute. The rates of household food insecurity affects 1 in 6 households in the city. With that in mind, we also know that food insecurity doesn't affect everyone equally. People who are living with a low income, renting, being on social assistance, these things are very much linked to our rates of food insecurity. Part of the response to COVID-19 has been focusing on the charitable food sector. There's been a huge push from the federal government to support this sector during this time. And that's looked like funding, support for infrastructure. So a lot of new ideas are coming forward that we're going to talk about today. And I just wanted to welcome everyone to share some of their personal experiences and experience in organizations. To give a better overview of what the COVID-19 response has sort of looked like on the ground, I'm going to turn it over to Katie, who's going to share some slides about the Community Food Helpline and the experience of Jimmy Pratt Foundation for operating that through the early days in May to September.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to share some slides there, so bear with me while I figure that out. If anybody was wondering what my favorite berry recipe is, it's anything with baked apples. So if you can recommend some recipes, please do in the chat. So the Community Food Helpline was started in May as a response to COVID, like Sarah said. At first it was a navigation service. So we realized that with everything shutting down because of COVID, people were going to be out of work, and there were going to be some people who were newly food insecure and wouldn't really know how to navigate that system, especially during a pandemic. So it still is a telephone line that people can call, and you can get information about your nearest food bank, how to access it, that sort of thing. We ended up pretty quickly realizing that food banks weren't totally filling the need for food hampers. So we ended up leveraging some COVID funding to be able to supply our own hampers and gift cards. So the gist of the food line was 811 operators would be able to refer to us, and then we would be able to help navigate, or we'd be able to help supply a hamper or something like that. And then we could also do delivery, which was a really big part of our role because PAL Airlines and Air Borealis was able to assist us with that. So we did a little bit of surveying, and we got some feedback from the food helpline as well as from a focus group that we did with food bank operators. So from May through September, we answered 704 calls on the helpline, and we got a lot of feedback from that. And then we hosted a focus group in October with 6 food bank operators from 4 food banks on the Northeast Avalon. So from food bank users, we kind of heard 3 main issues. So the amount of food, we found that the 1-month limit, so most food banks have a 1-month limit for receiving a food hamper. And we found that that was too long and that people weren't getting enough food in the hamper to actually sustain them through that 1-month period. We also found that the type of food wasn't sufficient for people trying to have a healthy diet. And then for people with allergies and with dietary restrictions, it was really difficult to find accommodations at the food banks that were available to them. And we also found that transportation was a big issue. So actually getting to and from a food bank, if you have a big family, then the hamper might be bigger, and that's really hard to transport by foot. So when we were able to offer delivery, that was a really popular option with our clients. And then from food bank operators in our focus group, the need for coordination was really obvious. They found that there was really discussion between food banks and between other food organizations, and there was really overall strategizing. Most of the food banks kind of run their own funding, they do their own funding models, that sort of thing, and there was little discussion. And then there was also a need for infrastructure, so things like commercial products for storing things like produce or milk, and actually being able to provide those foods. That was really big. And then accommodating different needs of different clients. So a senior might need something that's different than a family, and that might need something that's different than a single adult. And then food banks have to accommodate all of those different needs, and that's really, really difficult for operators. So that is mainly what we were finding and kind of what we wanted to discuss a little bit in the webinar today. Stop sharing my screen there now.
Thanks, Katie. So yeah, like this was a relatively new switch for the Jimmy Pratt Foundation to be offering these kind of food services. I think, you know, it kind of speaks to recognizing that there's been an incredible need in the community for food, and there's a lot of people working diligently to improve what's available and reach different people. Debbie is a food security and anti-poverty activist with different organizations, including the Social Justice Co-op, and running Sharing the Harvest. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to maybe your experience of using or choosing not to use food banks. What do you think is some of the biggest misconceptions about food banks?
Yeah, so I have used food banks in the past, even fairly recently. I think people maybe believe that you get a lot of food at a food bank, and like was mentioned, you don't get enough food. You probably get a week's worth of food if you're lucky. At a food bank, you're not getting enough food to feed yourself for a month, and so there's still a lot of cost in buying food. It's a really good help, but it's not your grocery budget for the whole month. Yeah, and I think that that's probably the biggest misconception, I think. And also, there's also a problem around the stigma attached to going to a food bank. That like only people who are really desperate should go to a food bank. If you need help, you should go. You shouldn't feel bad about it.
Yeah, and maybe for everyone on the call, you could tell us a little bit more about Sharing the Harvest, and why donations of meat, especially wild meat, have become so important to this conversation. Sorry, Debbie, you're muted.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I just lost you there for a second.
Yeah, sorry. Thinking about everything you've been involved with now through Sharing the Harvest, maybe you could explain a little bit about what that program is aiming to do and why donations of meat for food banks, particularly wild meat, has become so important this year.
Yes, so typically food banks do not get donations of meat. If they have meat, they have gone out and purchased it themselves. And as probably everyone here knows, meat's really expensive. And so for them to get donations of meat is excellent. They don't have to spend their money on that. They can spend their money on something else, or they can spend it on the meat they were going to and give people a little bit more meat in their hampers. The moose meat itself is a great source of protein. It's very healthy. Yeah, and through our program, we have it as ground moose. And so you can use it for burgers. You can use it for like shepherd pie. You can make spaghetti and make meatballs, whatever you want to do. So yeah, I think also it gives people like a sense of pride that they're eating something local, and it's for the moose meat itself. I mean, it's like a special treat for people, I think, because not everybody has access to moose like normally. So I think it's really nice that somebody can go to the food bank and they can get a special food like that. We actually just dropped off a donation to Bridges to Hope. And Jody Williams at Bridges to Hope, he made a really good point. He said people who are coming to a food bank should be getting a similar experience to people who shop at a supermarket. You should be getting the foods that you want and foods that you're going to use. So I thought that was a really good point that Jody made.
Thanks so much, Debbie. I know through the focus group with the Jimmy Pratt Foundation, we heard a lot about infrastructure challenges. Jody was on that call, and in fact, like, he had run out of storage space and was using different like church basements and things. So there's definitely quite a lot of like challenges, especially with like volunteer groups who are each running their own set of programs. One of the challenges as well is also like managing donations. And I want to toss it over to Leah White and tell us a bit about the role of Second Harvest and your new food rescue app that's available.
So Second Harvest has been around for quite a while. Our brick and mortar is based out of Toronto, but our app has been up and running for 2 years now. I've been here in St. John's as head of operations for foodrescue.ca since August. We have quite a few nonprofit organizations on the platform right now. The app is essentially like the eHarmony of food. We connect nonprofit organizations to local food businesses, and we've discovered that in a few studies that we've done with BCMI at Value Chain Management, that 58% of food that's produced is actually wasted. And of that 58% of food, 32% is still perfectly edible. So the app is trying to get that food into the hands of people who need it and who are hungry and out of landfill.
And as well, being involved with one of the federal projects, the Surplus Food Project, maybe you could tell us a bit about what you've learned in terms of like that infrastructure piece of like making distribution and deliveries happen to volunteer organizations.
Absolutely, and that was something I know I saw in the chat about rural organizations. And we do have, of course, the bulk of our organizations are in St. John's, but we do have a fair few rural organizations as well. And the program that we're working on right now is called the Surplus Food Rescue Program. I was part of this very large government grant to get food that was in surplus because restaurants had been shut down. So there was this surplus food. So the money was spent on purchasing the food and having it delivered to all over Canada, from literally coast to coast to coast, which is a huge expense. to do, but we were given the money, we were granted the money to do so. So there's food going to food banks in Buren and places that are not usually used to getting these foods. But the cost is large. It's a large cost to get them to these places. But we are giving them, there are some really great commodities. It's been eggs and chicken and turkey and things that were in surplus at the time of the initial shutdown, which, as Debbie said, the value of really good proteins is exponential, because I mean the cost of the sides and stuff like that to build meals around that really valuable protein is super, super important. And of course, healthy foods too, and we want to make sure they're also culturally appropriate too.
Thanks so much, Leah. Katie, from the focus group, like we did hear a lot from food bank operators about challenges with that. Like, what were some of the examples that you kind of pulled out of that group in terms of being able to store, distribute, and like individualize Pampers for people?
Yeah, so one big thing that came up was actually having infrastructure for being able to store things like fresh produce. So it was mentioned that even if you can get funding for things like commercial refrigerators, for example, which you need to be able to store kind of bulk food, you can't get them into the doors of the food bank or the space that you're in, because most of them are older buildings. So there isn't really a space where, if there is extra food, it can be diverted to actually give out. There just isn't enough space. So that was a big issue that came up a lot in the focus group. Yeah, I think that was kind of the big one. And then in terms of coordinating between organizations, it was brought up that people might be interested in having a shared space where they would be able to divert food. So.
Thanks, Katie. So thinking about, like, there is some coordination happening between organizations in the city, but it's very seldom that food banks, volunteers, and even for organizations with staff get the chance to meet and discuss with each other. A key activity that Food First NL took on this winter, which seems like so long ago, was bringing together a community update after Snowmageddon. And I think in some ways this was a bit of a dry run. Snowmageddon shut down the city for about a week. And in terms of essential services, it wasn't obvious or clear that food banks or meal programs that serve hundreds of people every day in the city could actually be open. In addition to the logistical challenge of people getting out of their driveways and around the city when the roads were in such a state. So from that community update, our organization worked with several people, which are here on the call and in the chat, to discuss ways we can have a more coordinated response. And it was really important in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic to have like a central place to bring all that information together, who's open, who's not, and keeping in mind that folks without data, folks without a cell phone or internet access, were really out of that conversation. So yeah, kudos to everyone for working on the community food helpline and other community resources to reach people in who need it. So all of these things in mind, I wanted to go around and ask a bit of a big picture question. What would you like to see in terms of cooperation, not just between food organizations, but food justice, anti-poverty work in the city, or even dream bigger, Newfoundland and Canada? I'd like to maybe turn it over to Debbie first and hear from your perspective what some ways we can better coordinate and cooperate to address food insecurity.
Yeah, so one of the things you mentioned was how there's no kind of but there's not really a central hub where everyone who's doing all this good work can really talk to each other. And I think if we were more connected, it would be good. Sometimes like a food bank will get a large donation, and maybe they can't really use all the food up quickly. And so maybe they could donate some to another food bank, but they really don't know who they should call. Yeah, I think if there was more of like a central hub for that kind of stuff where people could connect. And yeah, and like not just food banks, but like everybody could be involved, like Leah's organization could be involved too.
Yeah, thanks. Leah, do you want to follow up on that?
Absolutely. And I have had this happen in the past couple of weeks where I'm so happy that it's happened that people have called me with larger donations, and I've tried to get them spread out across with as far as my network goes. And I'm on the phone with Neria trying to figure out what we're going to send bananas. But I think a place where we could send a large amount of food and then have a network that is able to, like say foodrescue.ca could send a blast out with multiple notifications on the application, stuff like that, multiple places can go and pick up these food items, which I've tried to coordinate myself offline, and it is exceedingly difficult to get people to all meet up at the same place to go pick up this food and to find a place that can store the food. Because there's not really a lot of places that have that capability of storing big food, unless they're, like a warehouse or something like that, which we don't have enough of, I don't think, as far as my experience so far. But that's something that I'm really hoping for. It's a big hope that we can have like a hub that I can work with to get this food to the people who need it the most and the programs that can use it the most.
Thanks. And this reminded me of some of the work, I guess, sort of related to the Jimmy Pratt Foundation. Maybe Neria or Katie, you wanted to chime in on like accepting like a large donation when Dominion went on strike, or what other potential you might see from your perspective for coordinating around like early learning and childhood on food insecurity issues.
Well, I can pop in here for sure. That's such a timely question. And sorry, I'm just going to minimize the chat for a second because there's some great conversation going on there. But it's such a timely question about how does this emergency food system fit into our larger social support systems? How do we because what we're learning, and I think what food banks have always known, is that they can't solve food insecurity on their own, right? This is a huge systemic issue. And charity and philanthropy, like we're a philanthropic organization, is important, and it's an established tradition. When we're thinking about food insecurity, it's a systemic problem that spans the jurisdiction of so many different organizations, right? And so we're trying to think, what we've learned from this, at least as an organization, is how can we bring a food security lens to everything that we do. And so we're actually, I was on that, Kimberly Oren is in the chat here. Oh, just really quickly, Chelsea Pike says, we're only seeing part of the combo in the chat. Looks like some individuals may be sending messages to just the panelists. That is likely the case. Zoom is that's a really annoying tick of Zoom, that the default seems to be when you send a message to the chat that it only sends it to the panelists. So yeah, if you do send a message to the chat, just try and pop it to change it from just panelists to all panelists and attendees. It's super annoying. Where I've seen that, I've tried to copy it and put it into the full chat. But yeah, sorry about that. That's a real Zoom issue. We should bring it up with them. But yeah, so back to food security. It's kind of a lens, and it's something that we need to think about really systemically. We need to be thinking about a living wage, and about the reasons why people can't afford food in the first place. And I think the Dominion strike really brought things into perspective. It was a really bizarre situation where we were receiving huge donations of fresh food that people would never have had access to, and we were just kind of trying to get it out before it went bad. And we had this amazing, crazy day where we received a full refrigerated truck full of fruits and vegetables, and people were coming to get them. Especially, we worked really with Neighbors in Need as well. We worked with Leah and with all kinds of food banks to try and just get it out and get it to people before it went bad. And the feedback we were getting overwhelmingly is that this is the kind of food that people who are food insecure would never get to eat. And while we receive the message from when we're infants, from when we're kids, that like you need to have 5 servings of vegetables a day, you need to be eating this much protein, the reality is that that's really hard for a lot of people. And we are hearing from a lot of families that this was the first time that since they could remember, that they were able to offer that from no fault of their own. So I think it was the Dominion strike really put that kind of friction into perspective, because on the one hand, we had these huge amounts of surplus food that we were having trouble getting out, while we had workers campaigning for a living wage, and some of them saying that they even had to visit food banks to supplement their own income. And so food security is part of so many different issues. And Kim and I were chatting this morning about how we can bring a food security lens to early childhood education, how we can start that earlier, and bringing fish to daycares maybe. So sorry, that was a bit of a long answer to a wonderful question. But yeah, what we've learned from this experience is that food insecurity is not just a food bank problem, is not just a problem for food banks. In fact, food banks are really a last resort, and they're really picking up where all the other systems have failed. And given the stigma attached with going to see a food bank that we're hearing about in the chat here, that we heard about on our food line all the time, people really are desperate already when they reach a food bank. That's really should be the last resort, and we need to support our food banks by making sure that people are supported in other ways as well.
Thanks for that, Neria. Yeah, it's definitely food banks are part of like a coping strategy, and I think that you're right that they are often the last resort, and there's a lot of people who are food insecure who would never use a food bank. In fact, I believe some of the stats from Proof, it's like only 20% of people who are food insecure would actually use that kind of service. Yeah, so like kind of led into like a really kind of interesting closing question, and I'll pose that to our other panelists. You know, it takes a lot of people to get to solving this issue, and a lot of different sectors. So thinking about government policy and poverty reduction strategies and other upstream approaches, what would you like to see from these other sectors to improve food security? I'll throw it over to Debbie.
Sorry, I lost you again for a second. Can you repeat it? Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm issues here today.
Yeah, just thinking about like what kind of supports from other sectors could be taken to improve both emergency food programs, but also looking upstream and bigger so that people could afford those other costs of living.
Well, what we just dealt with was like we had to go to the government and get things changed so that hunters could donate moose meat to the food banks. There's a lot of red tape around donations of food that there probably shouldn't be. Like I understand there's liability issues and things, but like somebody should be able to donate moose. It should have been done a long time ago. So there's a lot of red tape, things that could be eliminated. And
Sorry, you're muted.
accidentally I muted myself. And it has been mentioned, it's, you know, food banks are, what I always say is food banks are like a Band-Aid, and like poverty is the wound. And so you have to treat the wound. You know, the Band-Aid is okay for right now, but you have to go and get your stitches or whatever. So you have to treat the poverty, you have to treat the issue of poverty. And we do that by paying a fair minimum wage. You look at the people who are on income support, they receive about $200 a week. When CERB came in, we said the minimum someone needs is $500 a week. So why are we saying it's okay for these people to get $200 a week? You know, that's, and expecting them to live on it. Expecting somebody to live in St. John's on $900 a month it's impossible. And we're putting people in these really bad positions where they have to choose between eating food and paying rent, or paying rent and paying for medications. And so, yeah, I think we have to address the poverty issue. And yeah, and that's by paying a fair minimum wage and maybe bringing in a basic income, something like that.
Thanks, Debbie. And like coming at it from like a bit of a different angle, Leah, I was wondering what opportunities you're kind of seeing for policy shift, change from your perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Just kind of springboard off of what Debbie said as well. I had a few friends just comment too. If people are making more money on CERB or the CERB, like there's a problem going on with our minimum wage. If $500 a week is, that should be a bare minimum for people to survive and to eat well, and to also springboard off the red lines. There is a lot of red tape around kind of these things too, but there are a donation of food acts in each province. So as long as there's no malicious intent behind donating the food, or like knowing that the food is, say, rotten or whatever, the food donor is not liable. And I think that education is a really big thing when it comes to donating. A lot of people don't know that they could probably be donating a lot of this food that's perfectly good and perfectly edible and ends up in landfill, but they don't know because a lot of, I tell people all the time, I know Debbie does too, about the Donation of Food Act, and I will scream it from a rooftop, but people oftentimes don't know it. But to kind of bring it back to Second Harvest and what we're trying to do as well, we're simply a tool to try to make donating food easier. That's all we are trying to do. The online platform is free for anyone to use, and people are using it. We have a few donors on board at St. John's, and I think they were just absolutely shocked at how quickly the donations are picked up by nonprofits. Within minutes, they're claimed, and within an hour, they're picked up. So there's clearly a need, and we're hoping to address it very much. So I'm hoping to at least help a little bit.
Thanks, Leah. Katie, would you like to chime in there? Thinking about like what opportunities there are to like get to some of these root causes everyone's talking about.
For sure. So I'm really agreeing with Debbie. My background is in public health, and we really talk about poverty as a public health issue, not only food insecurity, but in terms of health issues down the road that it can cause and all of those things. But we know that food insecurity isn't, it's poverty is the root cause of food insecurity. It's not caused by people not budgeting correctly or prioritizing the wrong things. It really is just people do not have enough money to actually pay for their food. So the way that we can address those in public health, we tend to think of big systemic things. And I would agree with Debbie that things like a universal basic income, which people have been talking about a lot recently, a fair minimum wage, they are really the best ways, in my opinion, that we can address the actual root cause of food insecurity, which is poverty. And then I can quickly speak to kind of how it relates to JPF and early childhood learning outcomes, if you'd like. So, like I said, there's food insecurity and poverty being health issues. We know that nutrition is important for brain development and growth and learning, and we know that aside from the nutrition aspect of it, things like going to school when you're hungry make it really hard to pay attention to your teacher and to socialize with your classmates and all of those other things that we want kids to be able to do. So it really does dovetail nicely with our mandate of kind of improving early childhood education and making the world a little bit easier for kids to grow into resilient adults. That's my piece on it.
Just to add to that, thank you so much, Katie. You put that really beautiful, really eloquently. The last thing that we would kind of say we had kind of an interesting perspective. We had a really interesting perspective because we had this kind of overview. We were hearing from people who were relating to who were calling all kinds of different food banks in different parts of the city. And what really came out of this for us is that we need to be thinking about how we can support food banks to do their job. which is to be a dignified service that gives people the food that they need when there's absolutely nothing else nowhere else for them to turn. But there have to be so many other supports that are there before folks get to a food bank. And advocating for people to advocating for people to be food secure means starting earlier, and maybe hoping that people don't get to food banks, and that they have other ways to make sure that they have food and they have heat and they have light and they have the things that make them comfortable and make their lives enjoyable. And so this is a conversation for us about supporting food banks and making sure that when what we're hearing overwhelmingly from food bank operators is that they want to offer better food, they want to offer produce, they want to offer bigger hampers more often, but they just can't because the need is just never ending. Going back to the title of this talk, which is Never Enough. It really isn't. It looks like we have someone new here. I will be quiet for a second, but that's it from us. Really, so we want to support food banks to do what they do and do it the best way that they want to.
Thanks for that, Neria. Sarah Keene just joined us. Welcome, Sarah. We're eager to hear from Sarah, who for a long time was the intake worker at Adams Avenue with the Salvation Army Food Bank, and has now just moved into the new building downtown, the Salvation Army Chess Penny Center, New Hope Center?
Center of Hope.
Center of Hope. Sorry about
it's
that.
a mouthful. Yeah.
So yeah, we're just kind of wrapping up with some questions on, what are opportunities for coordination in the city? And there's been a lot of lovely comments in the chat. So we want to address some of those. But Sarah, I'd love to just hear a little bit from your perspective, like given all of the programs you do, meals, food banks, hampers, gift card drives, what are some things you're doing to make your food services more welcoming for the people who use them?
So hold on, I got little notes here. I was like, I cannot forget anything. There's going to be too many people watching this. So I guess, well, I got them everywhere. So the big thing that we did this year when we moved to our new building is we switched our food bank from a pre-packed, here you go, here's some food, hope it works, have a nice day philosophy program to a choice model. So that was kind of the big thing that we did. It's really new. And even today we were like, wait, can we tweak this a little bit better? So when they go into intake with our intake worker, Beth, she has a list and it's almost like a choice. Like, would you rather this kind of soup or this kind of soup? Do you not like this or would you rather this? So that's kind of the way we're doing. That's our big way that we've started. And so far it's going really well. Sometimes clients don't know what to do when asked if they have a choice. We've seen really weird reactions. They're not really sure how that's a thing now. So that's kind of fun. So yeah, so that's our big one for sure. Yeah.
Awesome. And you mentioned previously we were getting organized for this a lot about like the use of gift cards and
Yep.
other things.
Yeah, so Christmas time specifically, we've switched from the traditional Christmas dinner with turkey, ham, and all the dressing, the fixings to gift cards. We noticed our increase at Christmas, especially. We have a lot of like new Canadians that are coming and a lot of like dietary restrictions, and what we were giving them for Christmas just wasn't working anymore. And so for that particular program itself, we do the gift cards instead. So if they want to go buy whatever fits their need, we don't really care what you buy, just as long as it works for you. I had a gentleman last year and he was like, can I buy all Kraft Dinner? And I was like, if you want to buy all Kraft Dinner, you go right ahead. So that's kind of the one way we unfortunately, financially, we can't swing gift cards all year round, but we are able to do it thanks to some fabulous donations to do it at Christmas.
Thanks so much for that. And a couple of comments in the chat just acknowledging like how excellent that is for like dietary restrictions and obviously the dignity around choosing your own food, and being able to move towards a choice model. Debbie, you put in the chat a great note that people who live on a low income know how to bargain shop. They have all of the food skills to make a dollar stretch. And I think that's really important to recognize and acknowledge that, yeah, it's not about being able to budget properly. So thank you all for just like having a bit of this guided conversation with us today. I wanted to dig into some questions from panelists. There's been an ongoing chat box, but it maybe is a little bit hard to follow everything. So if participants, there's quite a few attendees, or I have like over 40 people on this call. So if you wanted to pose a question and learn a bit more, feel free. I'm also going to pick out a couple and call on our panelists. Leah, there's a lot of interest when you mentioned the app, the foodrescue.ca. Maybe you could just explain a bit more that who's that for and who can use it?
So the application is set up right now for food businesses, restaurants, grocery stores, whatever have you. Farms would be great to get some more farms on, and local nonprofits. Reason being, there are, of course, those rules and regulations that we have as far as food safety. Food safety is a really huge part of what we're doing as well, to make sure that food stays temperature safe, all that kind of stuff. So right now it's set up that way, not individual to individual, but it is a free application that is for linked with community food sharing. I have a couple of people that I'm sorry, reading the question in the chat. We are not.
So the question was, how does it link with the Community Food Sharing Association?
So we are not linked. We sometimes, when I get larger donations, I try to give them a shout and see if we can help each other out at all. But right now we are not affiliated. We're not, we have quite a lot of food banks on nationally. Some really big ones like Mosa Montreal, we actually work close with. But for the most part, we are not affiliated with Food Banks Canada, if that answers that question.
Yeah, so there is another question for you, Leah, juicy one. Some of the biggest donors are large corporations that donate to Second Harvest, with like some practices around paying low wage, treating workers unfairly, preventing unionizing. How do you address that with like your day-to-day work of matching like food organizations up with the corporate donations?
So the corporate donations, right now with stuff going on in Newfoundland, I truly don't have anything to do with that. It's definitely something that is obviously Second Harvest is aware of. And these larger corporations do not donate to food banks whatsoever because of a lot of the rules and regulations that they have. So as far as low wages, of course, that's something that is super important to us too, but to have these relationships, at least the food isn't going to waste, and because otherwise a lot of these big organizations end up throwing the food out. So at the very least, at least that's not happening and it's not going into landfill. Sometimes these large organizations, they just will not donate food whatsoever. Walmart, we got a couple grants from Walmart to work with some smaller food banks too. But yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for asking though, Heidi. And so thinking about all of these things we've been like discussing in the call, Neria kind of put the question to the panel of how do we get to a food bank model that could put users first and center them over donations, or this idea of, I guess, like being scarcity, because that's one thing we've talked about, is that there is actually enough food in Canada to feed everyone. I'd love to hear some input from maybe Sarah. Do you have some thoughts about like how you can center food bank users with the work that you're doing?
Sure. I guess we've tried it with our shopping model because we think sometimes we have a problem with connection between what we think they want and what they actually want. So that's kind of why we tried to do the shopping model. But I think, yeah, it's kind of hard because we don't want to refuse a donation and we always want to accept what we're given, but it's sometimes there's a way of kind of directing them towards what we're really looking for sometimes. So if you can have the conversation with donors and say, oh, that's really good. And then kind of, so we're like constantly giving people, like if they make a donation to our food bank, we're constantly able to bring them in and give them a tour. And then they're like, oh, we never thought about that. And I'm like, there you go. So we're constantly trying to find ways to involve donors as much as possible so that they can see how it actually works. And then sometimes they kind of feel that they kind of get ideas of what they can give versus like they thought this was a great idea to give, but maybe this might be a little bit better. So I think if you involve them in kind of your processes, then it kind of helps a little bit.
And thanks, Sarah. I see Debbie there, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, so this morning we also visited Single Parents Association, and she had mentioned that what they really would love to receive is gift cards because they can go and do the shopping themselves, and they have ways to get discounts on things that the public doesn't know about, and they really know how to bargain shop too. I think you can also call your local food bank and ask them what they need, if they would, and if it's not gift cards, if you don't want to give gift cards, if you'd rather give like a donation of something, whatever reason, like you can ask them, what do you need right now, and go pick that up and bring it. I know a lot of people do that.
Yeah, and definitely need changes throughout the year. And there's a lot of people thinking about donations this time of year, heading into the Christmas season. Traditionally, people are more likely to make a large donation. So yeah, it's really timely to be chatting about what, if you do want to participate in donating, what would be the most effective, and then also thinking about throughout the year, what's the role of advocating for some of these larger systemic changes that we've all touched on. There was a few things mentioned in the chat that I just wanted to point out. Josh noted that there's several people participating in a letter, Coalition for a Just Recovery. So we'll certainly be able to share some information with that in kind of a conclusion for this panel, touching on just some of these issues, like a universal basic income in Newfoundland and Labrador, and among other things, and just a wholeheartedness, appreciation for what everyone is doing, different strategies on saving money with flash food apps. Yeah, so the chat has been very interesting to see that rolling around. And I just wanted to take this time and thank everyone for your input. And yeah, congratulations for all of the good works and things you've been doing. We know that we're framing food insecurity as an issue of like an income problem. And it was definitely going to take a lot of coordination and collaboration to change that, to change the rates in our province and in our city. So in terms of this panel today, this is just like one part of a conversation that we're hosting in St. John's on behalf of the St. John's Food Assessment. So we'll be following up this call by posting this recording online. We'll also be adding closed captioning to the recording. There will be a blog post summarizing what we've learned about food banks on our food assessment website, which is just foodstjohns.ca. And all of the attendees will also get a follow-up survey. So if you'd like to fill it out, tell us a bit more about some feedback for this event and share your ideas for ways of moving forward, we'd also take that into our final report. So again, thank you all so much for sharing your lunch break with us, and huge applause for our panelists. Thank you.
And thank you, Sarah. Amazing job.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.